The recruits laughed at her old map. They did not do it loudly, not to her face, but the sound was there, a ripple of snickers and sharp, derisive whispers in the humid air of the forward briefing tent. She heard them. Anya Petrova heard everything. Private Tanaka, his face aglow from the holographic blue of his tactical tablet, nudged Private Dubois beside him. He gestured with his chin toward the woman standing apart from the group, her back to them. Her hair, a stark silver gray, was pulled into a severe, functional bun. She was older than their parents, her frame lean but etched with a wiry strength that seemed out of place among their own youthful bulk. What truly drew their ridicule was the object she was carefully unrolling onto an empty supply crate. It was a map, but not like any they had ever used. It was not a digital projection or a polymer laminated printout. This was paper or perhaps cloth, yellowed with age, its creases as deep and permanent as the lines around her eyes. Faded ink marked it with spidery script and symbols that belonged to a different era. "Look at that thing," Tanaka whispered, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of the young and confident. "Probably used it to hunt mammoths." Dubois stifled a giggle. "My grandpa has one of those in his attic." "It's a fire hazard." Anya gave no indication she had heard. Her attention was solely on the map. Her finger, slender and calloused, traced a faint contour line that ran between two crudely drawn hills. She was here as a civilian consultant, a last-minute addition to the training roster, a specialist in unconventional terrain navigation. The term was vague, bureaucratic. To the recruits of Alpha Company, it meant she was a washed-up relic the brass had saddled them with. Their instructor, Sergeant Reyes, a man whose patience was worn thin by a week of relentless rain and arrogant trainees, shot a glare at Tanaka. "Something funny, Private?" Tanaka's smile vanished. "No, Sergeant." "Good. Then maybe you can explain to me the optimal route to observation point Gamma." "Since you're so entertained." Tanaka confidently tapped his tablet. "Yes, Sergeant. The unit's navigation suite indicates a direct path, bearing 297. Avoids the marshland to the south, minimal elevation gain. ETA 1700 hours." Anya's finger stopped on the map. She did not turn, did not raise her voice. She simply spoke to the stained canvas in front of her. "That route will fail." The whispers stopped. Every eye in the tent turned to her. Sergeant Reyes's jaw tightened. He was a good NCO, caught between a dismissive command and the strange, quiet woman they had sent him. "Excuse me, ma'am?" he asked. The word ma'am, a thin veneer of respect over a core of irritation. Anya finally turned. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, seemed to assess each of them in a single, sweeping glance. They were not unkind, but they were heavy, carrying a weight of knowledge that made the recruits shift uncomfortably. "The satellite data is incomplete," she said, her voice low and even, with a faint, unplaceable accent. "It shows the ground, but not the history of the ground. That path crosses the old Sovigrad line. The drainage culverts there were compromised during the winter floods 3 years ago. What your tablet sees as a dry creek bed is now a sinkhole 6 meters deep and filled with liquid mud. You will lose your light vehicles." A heavy silence descended. Tanaka stared at his perfect, blue-lit map, then at the old woman. A sinkhole? The data was updated hourly. She was just making things up. He could feel the disbelief from the others, a silent consensus that she was senile. But before anyone could challenge her, the tent flap was thrust aside, and Colonel Marcus Thorne strode in, bringing with him an aura of crisp authority that sucked the remaining warmth from the air. Colonel Thorne's presence commanded immediate silence. He was a man shaped by regulations and ambition, his uniform immaculate despite the pervasive mud outside. He surveyed the briefing, his gaze sharp and appraising, landing first on the glowing tablets of the recruits, then on Sergeant Reyes and finally, with a palpable drop in temperature, on Anya Petrova and her ancient map. He did not address her. He walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture, stopping before Sergeant Reyes. "Sergeant!" Thorne's voice was clipped, precise. "Report. Are we ready to move?" "Almost, sir," Reyes answered, his posture ramrod straight. Just finalizing the route with the trainees, and our consultant Thorne's eyes flicked to Anya. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. Ah yes, the consultant. He turned fully toward her now, his expression a carefully curated mask of professional condescension. He gestured vaguely at her map on the crate. Ma'am, I appreciate you joining us, but I must confess, I was expecting someone conversant with 21st century technology. We have real-time satellite imagery, thermal overlays, ground-penetrating radar. I'm not sure what that artifact can offer us. The recruits, Tanaka included, watched with rapt attention. This was the voice of authority validating their own private mockery. Anya met the colonel's gaze without flinching. Her calm was a stark contrast to his brittle energy. She did not rush to defend herself or her methods. She simply let the silence hang for a moment before replying. It offers memory. Colonel Thorne raised a skeptical eyebrow. Memory? Satellites see what is. They don't see what was, she explained, her tone that of a patient teacher. They don't show the farmer who buried his dead mule in that field 50 years ago, leaving a soft spot in the earth that will bog down a heavy vehicle. They don't show the forgotten trench from a forgotten war, now overgrown but structurally unsound. This map, she patted the worn cloth, remembers. Colonel Thorne's smile tightened. He was not a man who appreciated cryptic philosophy, especially from a civilian, an old woman at that. He saw her as a liability, a bureaucratic imposition from a higher command that still valued outdated, romantic notions of fieldcraft. I see, he said, the words heavy with dismissal. A charming sentiment. However, this is a military operation, not an archaeological dig. We rely on data, on quantifiable facts. Sergeant Reyes, we will proceed with the route Private Tanaka identified. It is the most efficient path according to every metric we have. He turned his back on Anya, a clear and final gesture. Have your people pack up. We move in 5-inch. He strode out of the tent without a backward glance. The message was clear. She was irrelevant. Sergeant Reyes looked from the departing colonel to Anya, a flicker of apology in his eyes. He was a soldier. He followed orders. You heard him, he barked at the recruits, his voice rougher than usual. Pack it up. Let's move. The recruits scrambled into action, a renewed energy of purpose filling the tent. Tanaka shot a triumphant look toward Dubois, a smirk playing on his lips. The old woman and her fairy tales had been put in their place. Anya did not seem to notice. She watched them for a moment longer, her pale eyes unreadable. Then, with deliberate, unhurried movements, she began to fold her map. She folded it not with anger or resignation, but with a kind of reverence, her fingers tracing the familiar creases. She was an anachronism, a ghost at a digital feast. But as she tucked the map into the worn leather satchel at her side, her gaze drifted past the bustling recruits, through the open tent flap, and out toward the darkening sky. She saw the way the clouds were gathering over the western ridge, a particular shade of bruised purple she recognized. She noted the subtle shift in the wind's direction, the way it carried the scent of wet iron from the soil. The technology saw a 30% chance of light showers. She knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with data, that a deluge was coming. The platoon moved out. The light armored vehicles churned a muddy path through the tall grass, their engines a low growl against the stillness of the valley. Inside the lead vehicle, Colonel Thorne sat beside the driver, his own tablet displaying the flawless blue line of their projected route. He occasionally glanced at the metrics, fuel consumption, average speed, estimated time of arrival, and a grim satisfaction settled over him. This was how modern warfare worked, efficiently, predictably, managed by data. Anya rode in the last vehicle in the convoy, a standard troop transport, seated near the rear hatch. She had been offered a place up front, a perfunctory gesture of courtesy from Sergeant Reyes, but she had declined. The back was better. It afforded her an unobstructed view of their wake. She watched the land they left behind, the twin tracks of compressed earth, the way the displaced water pooled, its color and turbidity telling a story. She did not look at a screen. Her focus was outside on the world itself. She observed the flight patterns of the birds, small, dark finches that were flying low and seeking shelter in the dense thickets. She saw the way the leaves on the silver birch trees were turning their undersides up, a classic sign of a coming storm. To the recruits in the transport with her, she was just a silent, brooding passenger. They were loud, flush with the easy confidence of a mission going according to plan. Tanaka and Du Bois were running a betting pool on their final arrival time, arguing over minutes and seconds. Anya's earlier warning was forgotten, dismissed as the rambling of an old woman out of her depth. Her gaze shifted from the landscape to the soldiers themselves. She studied their gear. Their boots were top of the line, but laced for comfort, not for a long march through sucking mud. Their packs were filled with high-energy ration bars, but she saw no one carrying the simple, waterproof bags of nuts and dried fruit that provided slower, more sustained fuel. They trusted their equipment implicitly. They had been trained to interface with technology, to rely on the digital umbilical cord that connected them to command, to the satellites, to the entire global network. They were good at it, but she saw a brittleness in that reliance. They knew how to follow the blue line on the screen. She wondered how many of them knew how to read the lines on the land itself. An hour into the journey, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on a patch of ground 100 meters ahead of their convoy. It was a gentle depression, barely noticeable, distinguished only by a richer, greener collection of weeds. To the vehicle's sensors, it was stable ground. To her, it was a red flag. She remembered the notation on her map, a small, faded cross with the word mule, written in her own youthful hand from a reconnaissance mission decades ago. A farmer's story, shared over a cup of harsh tea. A simple, mundane event, but the earth remembered. The lead vehicle, carrying Colonel Thorne, rolled right over it. The ground held. The second and third vehicles followed. Anya watched, her body tense. Perhaps the ground had compacted over the years. Perhaps she was wrong. Then the fourth vehicle, a heavier supply truck, hit the patch. There was a sickening lurch. The vehicle's front right wheel sank instantly, the sound a wet, gulping cough. The truck canted violently to one side, its engine screaming as the driver tried to reverse. Mud fountained from the spinning wheel. The convoy ground to a halt. Up ahead, she could see Colonel Thorne climbing out of his vehicle, his face a mask of fury. The perfect, efficient timeline was broken. Anya said nothing. She simply watched, her earlier warning about the history of the ground echoing in the sudden, frustrated silence. She felt no satisfaction in being right. She only felt a familiar, weary sense of inevitability. The sky, as if on cue, began to weep, a light drizzle turning the dust to a greasy film on the vehicle's windows. The real trouble had not even begun. The drizzle became a downpour. It was a cold, driving rain that sluiced in sheets across the valley, turning the landscape into a gray, blurred watercolor. The sky went from bruised purple to a deep, featureless slate. Thunder cracked overhead, a concussive boom that vibrated through the metal hulls of the vehicles. The problem with the mired supply truck quickly became a secondary concern. A series of sharp, crackling pops echoed from the communications console in the lead vehicle. Then silence. "Comms are down," the operator announced, his voice tight. "Everything. Primary, secondary, satellite link." Total blackout. Colonel Thorne slammed a fist against the vehicle's interior wall. "What about navigation?" "GPS is gone, sir. The storm's causing too much atmospheric interference. The tablets are just tablets now. No signal." The blue line that had guided them, the source of their certainty, had vanished. They were blind. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of the platoon's discipline. The recruits, who had been laughing an hour earlier, were now silent, their faces pale in the dim light of the transport. They looked at their useless, dark screens, a dawning horror in their eyes. Their digital world had collapsed. Sergeant Reyes was trying to organize a recovery effort for the stuck truck, but his orders were swallowed by the roar of the rain. The ground was rapidly turning into a quagmire. The more they tried to tow the truck, the deeper it sank. They were wasting time and fuel, and Thorne knew it. "Leave it." Thorne's voice, broadcast over the short-range squad radios, was strained. All personnel, rally at the lead vehicle. We need a new route. Now the soldiers scrambled through the mud and driving rain, huddling in a miserable, dripping mass around Thorne's command vehicle. He stood under a makeshift tarp, his uniform now soaked and mud-splattered, his authority fraying. He and Reyes were bent over a paper map, a standard issue, recent printout, not Anya's relic. The original extraction point is impossible now, Reyes said, pointing. We've lost too much time. We'd have to cross the Blackwater tributary. And in this rain, it'll be a torrent. Thorne traced a line with his finger. What about this way? Through the Asper Valley Pass. It's a longer route, but the terrain looks stable. It will take us to the secondary extraction at Grid 88 Delta. A young lieutenant, the platoon's intelligence officer, cleared his throat nervously. Sir, initial intel briefings mentioned unconfirmed reports. About Asper Valley. What reports? Thorne snapped. Spit it out, Lieutenant. Old reports, sir. From the Saravian conflict. There are rumors the valley was mined by retreating partisans. The ghost fields, they called them. No official records exist. No maps. The fields were supposedly laid without any pattern, sown like seeds. It's considered impassable. A new wave of fear washed over the assembled soldiers. Minefield. It was a primal word, conjuring images of hidden, indiscriminate death. Thorne stared at the map, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his cheeks stood out. They were trapped. To the south was the now impassable river. To the north, the mountains were too steep. The way back was a sea of mud. The only viable path forward was through a place legends called the Ghost Fields. The pressure was immense. His command, his career, and the lives of the soldiers shivering in the rain all rested on his next decision. He looked at their faces, at the fear and uncertainty reflected in their eyes. His own data-driven certainty was gone, replaced by a terrible, gnawing doubt. He had led them here confidently, dismissively, and he had no idea how to lead them out. It was in that moment of absolute crisis, as the rain hammered down and hope dwindled, that a quiet voice cut through the noise. There is a way. All heads turned. Anya Petrova stood just outside the circle, seemingly impervious to the rain that plastered her gray hair to her scalp. She held her leather satchel in one hand. She was not looking at the colonel's map. She was looking at the mouth of the valley itself, her gaze distant and focused, as if she were seeing something they could not. Anya stepped forward into the small circle of command, the water dripping from her chin. She did not wait for permission. She moved with a quiet purpose that commanded attention more effectively than any shouted order. She laid her satchel on the hood of the vehicle, the leather dark and slick with rain, and from it, she once again produced her old cloth map. It was damp, but the canvas backing had protected the paper. She unrolled it next to Thorne's pristine, useless printout. The contrast was stark. One a product of sterile data, the other a living document worn and marked by human hands. The ghost fields are real, she said, her voice calm and steady amidst the storm's fury. The soldiers nearby flinched at the confirmation. But sown like seeds is a myth. No soldier, not even a desperate partisan, wastes assets so randomly. There is always a logic. A reason. Her finger, steady and sure, landed on the map, pointing to the entrance of the Asper Valley. On her map, unlike Thorne's, the area was not blank. It was covered in a web of faint, almost invisible markings. There were small, hand-drawn symbols, notations in her faded script, and a single, thin, meandering line that wove its way through the cluster of symbols. Colonel Thorne stared at the markings, his face a mixture of disbelief and desperation. What is this? What am I looking at? A memory, Anya repeated, echoing her earlier statement. I was here when they laid them. I was part of the unit that tracked the partisans who did it. A stunned silence fell over the group, broken only by the drumming of the rain. Tanaka, standing at the edge of the huddle, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This old woman wasn't just a consultant. She had been here in this very valley during a war he had only read about in history books. They used the terrain, Anya continued, her voice drawing them in, a lifeline in the storm. They had no engineering core, no survey equipment. They used what was already there. See this symbol? She pointed to a small circle with a dot in the center. It marks a weeping stone, a large granite boulder that constantly seeps groundwater. It's a permanent landmark. They laid a sequence of 3 pressure mines 10 paces north of every weeping stone in the valley. She moved her finger. This symbol, the triangle, marks a lightning-scarred pine. The partisans were superstitious. They believed lightning strikes sanctified the ground. They never mined within sight of one. These trees form the spine of the safe corridor. She traced the meandering line. This is the path. It follows the pines, it respects the stones. It is not straight. It is not efficient. But it is safe. Thorne stared from her ancient map to her weathered face, his mind reeling. He was being asked to stake the lives of his entire platoon on cryptic symbols, on weeping stones and superstitious partisans, on the memory of a woman he had dismissed as a relic. Every instinct, every piece of his training, screamed at him to reject it. It was madness. That's insane, he breathed, the words barely audible. To trust a hand-drawn map from decades ago? Over our own protocols? We should wait for the storm to pass, for comms to be restored. By then, the secondary extraction window will have closed, Anya stated flatly. The river will be too high to ford for at least 3 days. We will be stranded. Your soldiers are cold and wet. Their morale is low. Waiting is the greater risk. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. You trusted your data, and it led you into a sinkhole. Now you must decide if you can trust experience. The choice was laid bare. He could cling to his failed methodology and risk a slow, miserable failure, or he could take a terrifying leap of faith on this strange, quiet woman and her map of memories. The weight of command pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. He looked at the faces of his soldiers, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. The decision hung in the air, thick and heavy as the storm clouds. Colonel Thorne's mind was a battlefield. His career was built on procedure, on quantifiable risk assessment. What Anya proposed was the antithesis of all of it. It was an act of faith, and faith was not a currency the modern military traded in. Yet he could not ignore the facts. His technology had failed. His judgment had been flawed. They were trapped. He looked at Anya, at the unshakable certainty in her pale eyes. It was not the certainty of arrogance, but of deep, hard-won knowledge. He looked at her map, no longer seeing a relic but a tapestry of experience he could not comprehend. His gaze then fell upon Private Tanaka, who stood nearby, his face stripped of its earlier bravado, now just showing the raw fear of a young man in over his head. The entire platoon was watching, waiting for him to save them, and he knew he could not alone. All right? Thorne said, the word tasting like surrender and hope all at once. His voice was quiet, but it carried with absolute authority. All right, Petrova. We'll do it your way. A collective, silent exhale seemed to pass through the soldiers. It was not relief, not yet. It was the tension of a new, even more terrifying phase beginning. Thorne turned to his platoon. You heard her. We move on foot. Single file. No talking. No electronic devices. You watch the person in front of you and you put your feet exactly where they put theirs. Sergeant Reyes, you'll take the rear. I'll be right behind our guide. He looked at Anya. Lead the way. Anya gave a single, sharp nod. She refolded her map and tucked it securely inside her rain-soaked jacket, against her chest. She didn't need to look at it anymore. The path was etched into her mind as surely as it was drawn on the cloth. She turned and began walking toward the mouth of Asper Valley, her pace steady and measured. The platoon fell into line behind her, a long, silent serpent of nervous soldiers. Thorne took his position directly behind her. Reyes moved to the back, his face grim. The recruits, including Tanaka and Dubois, found their places in the middle of the column. The mockery was gone, replaced by a primal, focused fear. They were entrusting their lives to the old woman and her map. Tanaka watched her back as they walked. She moved with an economy of motion he had never seen before. She did not stumble. Her feet seemed to know the ground before they touched it. He found himself trying to mimic her gait, the way she rolled her foot from heel to toe, testing the earth with every step. The entrance to the valley was marked by two great pillars of dark rock. As they passed between them, the wind seemed to die down, and a strange, profound silence fell over the area, the roar of the rain muffled by the high valley walls. They were in. The air grew colder. The ground was a carpet of damp moss and black soil, littered with stones of all sizes. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rock looked like a pressure plate. The soldiers' eyes darted back and forth, their knuckles white where they gripped their rifles. Their gazes kept shifting from the ground to Anya's back. She was their compass now, their only point of certainty in a world of lethal unknowns. She was no longer a relic. She was their only hope. The shift in perception was total and absolute. The woman they had dismissed was now the center of their universe. Her quiet confidence, once seen as odd, was now a source of immense, if terrifying, reassurance. They had laughed at her map. Now they were praying it was right. The crossing began. Anya moved not with speed, but with a deliberate, rhythmic grace. Her eyes were not fixed on the ground directly before her feet. They scanned 20, 30 meters ahead, reading the macrotells of the terrain. She was looking for the landmarks from her memory, the signposts of safety. The rain had plastered her silver hair to her head, and water trickled down the lines of her face, but she seemed not to notice. Her focus was absolute. Behind her, Colonel Thorne found himself holding his breath. He was a man accustomed to being in control, to seeing the entire strategic picture. Now, his world had shrunk to the few square feet of muddy ground behind Anya Petrova. He watched her boots, placing his own in their exact prints, a humbling act of submission. He felt the fear of his soldiers behind him as a palpable force, a wave of anxiety pressing at his back. He had to trust her. There was no other choice. Tanaka, further back in the line, felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The world had dissolved into a series of simple, terrifying instructions. Watch the boots in front of you, place your own boots in the same spot, do not deviate. The casual confidence he'd felt just hours ago was a distant memory, a phantom from another life. He saw a glint of metal under a fern to his right and his blood ran cold. But the line kept moving, and he forced himself to look forward, to trust the path. Anya paused. The entire column froze behind her, a chain reaction of held breaths. She stood before a massive granite boulder, slick with rain and draped in dark green moss. From a fissure near its base, a steady trickle of water seeped out, staining the rock a darker shade. A weeping stone. Anya stopped and looked north, her head tilted as if listening. She took 10 precise, measured paces to her left, away from the direct path, bringing the column with her. She was circumnavigating the spot her memory told her was lethal. No one questioned it. They simply followed. They continued like this for what felt like an eternity. The path was a maddening zigzag, weaving through the valley in a way that defied all military logic. They passed a towering pine tree, its trunk blackened and split down the middle, a jagged scar from a long-ago lightning strike. Anya gave the tree a wide berth, her path curving around it in a graceful arc. She was following the pattern, the hidden language of the landscape. The tension was beginning to wear on the younger soldiers. Private Dubois, walking just ahead of Tanaka, stumbled on a loose rock. She cried out, a short, sharp gasp of fear, and her foot slipped from the established path, landing on a patch of soft moss just 6 inches to the left. The entire column froze. Every muscle in Tanaka's body locked. Sergeant Reyes, at the rear, began to move forward, his face a deathly white. But Anya reacted before anyone else. She did not turn around. She simply said, "Do not move, Private." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the rain with the sharpness of a blade. She took 2 steps back, her own feet unerringly finding their previous prints. She stood beside the terrified Dubois. "Lift your foot," Anya commanded, her voice low and calm. Slowly, straight up. Dubois was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with terror. I can't." Yes, you can, Anya said. Her hand shot out and gripped Dubois's arm, not with force, but with a steady, grounding pressure. Look at me. Dubois's tear-filled eyes met Anya's calm, pale blue ones. Breathe, and lift your foot. As if mesmerized, Dubois did as she was told. She lifted her boot from the moss. Underneath, nestled in the soft earth, lay a small, circular object. It was a disc of rusted metal, barely visible, with 3 small prongs pointing upward. Tell her mine. It was old, corroded, and the pressure plate had likely seized decades ago. It might not have detonated, but it might have. Anya calmly guided Dubois back onto the path. Stay focused, she said, not unkindly. She then looked back down the line, her gaze sweeping over them all. The earth does not forget. Do not get careless. She turned and resumed walking, leaving a platoon of deeply shaken, profoundly grateful soldiers in her wake. The second test had been passed, not just of her knowledge, but of her nerve. She was not just a guide. She was a guardian. They cleared the last of the treacherous ground as dusk began to settle, the rain finally easing to a persistent drizzle. The valley opened up into a wide, marshy plain. In the distance, they could see the blinking lights of the secondary extraction point. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over the platoon. They had made it. They had walked through the ghost fields and survived. Soldiers slumped against trees. Others simply sat down in the mud, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Private Dubois was being comforted by a squad mate, her face still pale with shock. Tanaka found himself staring at Anya's back. She was standing alone, looking back the way they had come, a solitary figure against the darkening landscape. Colonel Thorne approached the comms operator, who had managed to get a weak, intermittent signal on the long-range backup radio. Get me command, Thorne ordered, his voice hoarse. I need a file check on our civilian consultant. Petrova. Anya Petrova, the operator nodded, his fingers flying across the console. The connection was poor, a stream of static and garbled noise. Command, this is Victor Actual request file. Petrova, Anya, confirmation. Words came back in fragmented bursts, fighting through the atmospheric interference. No active file under that name. Cross-referencing auxiliary archives. Stand by. Thorne waited, his impatience warring with a strange new feeling of dread and awe. He had just witnessed something that defied explanation. He needed to know who she was. More static, then a clearer voice, tinged with the surprise of the operator on the other end. Found a match. Sealed Saravion conflict records. Asset designation Velis. Deep reconnaissance and pathfinding. Credited with Coral Pass evacuation. Single-handedly guided 300 civilians through unmapped minefields. Record sealed under National Security Directive 7. The radio operator at Thorne's side looked up, his eyes wide. Sir, did he say Velis? Thorne didn't answer. He was frozen, the name echoing in his mind. Velis. It wasn't just a name. It was a legend. A ghost story they told cadets at the academy. Velis was the mythical pathfinder of the Saravion Wars, an operative who could supposedly navigate by the stars and the feel of the wind, who could walk through minefields as if they weren't there. The stories claimed Velis was responsible for saving thousands of lives through impossible feats of navigation, always operating alone, leaving no trace. Most officers assumed Velis was a composite, a fabricated legend to boost morale, or perhaps a code name for a whole unit of scouts. No one believed Velis was a real person. Thorne slowly turned his head and looked across the clearing at the old woman with silver hair. He saw her not as he had before, a relic, a bureaucratic nuisance, but as the living embodiment of a legend. He saw the quiet demeanor not as weakness, but as the profound calm of someone who had faced death so many times it had become an old acquaintance. He saw the worn map not as an antique, but as a sacred text, written in the ink of experience and blood. The woman he had dismissed, the woman whose expertise he had openly mocked, was Velis. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a moment of humbling, terrifying clarity. He had been in the presence of greatness and had been utterly blind to it. His modern, data-driven world had collided with an older, deeper form of knowledge, and he had been found wanting. The laughter of his recruits in the briefing tent now seemed like a sacrilege. He felt a profound sense of shame, followed by an even more profound sense of respect. He had been saved not by technology or procedure, but by a ghost from a forgotten war. The low, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades grew louder, and 2 heavy transport helicopters descended toward the clearing, their landing lights cutting bright cones through the twilight mist. The extraction had arrived. Sergeant Reyes moved among the soldiers, his voice low but firm, getting them to their feet, organizing them into boarding squads. There was no elation, no cheering, just a quiet, weary efficiency. The day had taken too much from them. As the first squad began to move toward the nearest helicopter, Colonel Thorne walked across the muddy ground, his path taking him directly to Anya. She was still standing apart, watching the helicopters land, her expression unreadable. She had not sought him out, had not said a word since they cleared the valley. She did not need to. Thorne stopped a few feet in front of her. The wind from the rotors whipped at his already soaked uniform. He looked at the woman who had saved his command and his life, the living legend he had treated with such contempt. The words of apology he had rehearsed in his mind felt cheap, inadequate. They could not possibly convey the depth of his changed perspective. So he did not speak them. Instead, he straightened his back, bringing his shoulders square. He drew himself up to his full height, a colonel in the United States Army, a man of rank and authority. And in the muddy, desolate field, under the swirling wind of the helicopter blades, he raised his hand to his brow in a slow, deliberate, and perfectly executed salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a salute of profound, unreserved respect. A salute offered from one warrior to another. Anya met his gaze. She did not return the salute. She was a civilian. Instead, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her head. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a moment of silent communication that passed between them, more powerful than any words. Private Tanaka, waiting his turn to board, saw the exchange. He saw his colonel, a man he both feared and respected, saluting the old woman. He saw the look on Thorne's face, not of defeat, but of genuine reverence. The sight struck him with a force that locked his boots to the ground. He thought of his smirking face in the briefing tent, his whispered jokes about her map. Shame burned in his gut, hot and sharp. He looked at Du Bois, who was watching with wide, tear-streaked eyes. He looked at the other recruits. They had all seen it. As Colonel Thorne held his salute, Tanaka straightened his own posture. He too raised his hand to his brow. A moment later, Du Bois did the same. Then another soldier and another. A silent chain reaction spread down the line of waiting soldiers. One by one, the exhausted, mud-caked members of Alpha Company rendered a salute to the quiet, gray-haired woman who had led them through the valley of death. They saluted not out of orders, but out of a shared, intuitive understanding of what they had just witnessed. They were saluting competence. They were saluting courage. They were saluting the quiet dignity of a master. The last of the soldiers had boarded. Colonel Thorne was the final one to climb into the helicopter, turning back only once to look at Anya before disappearing inside. The ramp began to rise. Anya remained on the ground, having indicated she would wait for the second, smaller aircraft designated for support personnel. For a moment, she was alone in the clearing, the wash from the rising helicopter whipping her jacket around her. The noise faded as the aircraft climbed into the dark sky, leaving behind an echoing silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant rush of the now-swollen river. She stood for a long time, simply breathing the cool, clean air of the valley. The storm had passed completely, and stars were beginning to emerge in the ink-black sky. She felt the familiar ache in her bones, the deep weariness that came after such intense focus. It was a feeling she had known for most of a lifetime. From inside her jacket, she withdrew the cloth map. Her fingers, though cold, moved with practiced delicacy as she unfolded it one last time. In the faint starlight, she looked down at the web of lines and symbols. It was more than a map. It was a journal, a life. Each marking was a story, a person, a choice. The weeping stone where a young partisan had given her a drink of water. The lightning-scarred pine where she had sheltered from a shelling. The faint cross marking the mule's grave. A story told by a farmer whose face she could no longer remember, but whose kindness she had never forgotten. This map was the part of her that the official files could never capture. Velis was a name in a sealed record. This cloth held the truth of the ground, the weight of memory. She thought of the recruits, of their initial scorn and their final silent salute. It was a cycle she had seen before. The young, armed with their flawless technology, always dismissed the old, armed only with their scars. They always believed their new tools made them immune to the world's ancient dangers. And the world, in its own time, always taught them otherwise. With a final, lingering touch, she began to fold the map. She followed the old creases, her movements precise and reverent. The first fold, then the second, each square of worn canvas tucking into the next, until it was a compact, dense rectangle. It was not an artifact to be displayed in a museum, as the colonel had suggested. It was a tool, and its work for the day was done. She slipped it back into the leather satchel, the worn buckle clicking softly into place. She did not look back at the valley. She had already committed its every stone and shadow to her memory. Another layer added to the palimpsest in her mind. She turned her face toward the approaching lights of the second helicopter, her expression calm, her dignity intact. The respect had been earned, not demanded. And in the quiet solitude of the clearing, that was all that mattered.